Yes, and I'm sorry this recording will be a little bit short today on my part, but Elaine will be mopping it up. I have to leave for a funeral, which is why I'm in my collar today. But I did have an opportunity before we started taping to share with you a video that Marcia sent us of her 5-year-old granddaughter sharing greetings with us. And don't worry, you'll get to see it because I'm going to post it on our website as soon as I get permission from Grandma Marcia. But I hope that you get a chance to see it, and that glad we got to see it, because we're going to really need that sweetness that we just saw, because today we have a somewhat gruesome topic to examine in our selection of scripture. Today we're going to look at Exodus 21:12. That's what we're going to start with. And I know that we're slow, but if you can read it faster and come in with a nice, clear, contextual, historically accurate recap, we can work on that. But for now, let's look at Exodus 21:12. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. And here's that same text in another translation. He who strikes a man so that he dies is doomed to die. And another translation, he who fatally strikes a man and the man dies shall be put to death. So slightly different wording, but the intent of the law is the same. After the crime and the consequence of the crime, 2 human beings will be dead. So this law deals with murder, which is a very serious crime. And the ancients knew it was a serious crime, so they were absolutely clear about the burden of proof. The rabbis say the murder must be proven beyond a question. And this law is also in Deuteronomy, not just Exodus. It's also in Leviticus. It is a capital crime, which calls for a capital punishment. Now later, when the law is mentioned in Numbers, the law makes it clear that you can't buy your way out of this trouble. So you can't just reimburse the family. We're going to talk about that next week, for the death of their loved one. And you could do that in other ancient Near East communities, but not in ancient Israel. Now, this law demands death for the convicted, but it does not describe how the convicted person should die. Now, most scholars will say probably it was beheading, decapitation. This method was not uncommon at all in the ancient Near East. In fact, it was used all over the ancient Near East, except in Egypt, of all places. And that was for some very important reasons, because ancient Egyptians believed that the head was the seat of life, was the most important part of the body, and that you would need that part of the body in the next life. So beheading was reserved for only the most absolute worst criminals, because it was really a double punishment. It was the end of this life, and you got no afterlife. Now today, that method of execution is no longer used for anyone in Egypt, even for terrible criminals. But do you know that today in Egypt, 2025, there are at least 100 crimes that are punishable by death? And these include drug-related crimes. Now, back in the day, in that area of the ancient Near East, the most common form of execution after beheading was, can you guess? Stoning. And then after stoning, fire. burning a person to death, which seems to have been saved mostly as a punishment for sex crimes. And after that old standby, stoning and death by fire, then came flogging. Flogging, which wasn't always intended to be deadly. Flogging could just be a punishment. So the ancients clearly believed that strict consequences were appropriate for serious crimes because they believed that it served as a deterrent to more crime. So do you think they were right?
Probably not.
Yeah, well, before we take a stand on that, because it's very, very tricky. And we're going to talk about it a little bit today. Before we take a stand on whether punishments fit the crimes, just let's look at some of these punishments. And it's not pleasant, but we have to look, right? And keep in mind, we're not the only ones who had to look, because all of these punishments and penalties were performed in public. That was part of the punishment and the deterrent.
The public humiliation.
Exactly. There were no private executions.
Peer pressure.
Yeah, like we kind of have semi-private executions where I think members of the bereaved family can, or law enforcement, I'm not really sure. I think it differs in each state. But they open a curtain for just a brief period of time, and it's semi-private. But in the ancient world, it had to be public. So let's look at stoning first. And there were different ways to stone a person to death, but they're all horrible, brutal, gruesome. Now, at times, the convicted person was buried in the ground, either up to his knees or up to his or her chest. It depended. And then everyone in the community was required to hurl stones at the convicted person until death occurred. Stones, right? And that could take hours. Can you imagine? I can't. Now, another method of stoning, which scholars seem to think this was the most common. So the convicted person was pushed off a hill or a cliff, and if the fall didn't kill the person, then just one large stone was dropped onto the convicted's chest. And you know, we never set up the she never put up the microphones.
Oh, that's true.
Carrie, I'll speak up because we have no microphones. If that large stone on the chest didn't kill the person, then another stone was dropped on the person's head.
Oh, at least that didn't take all day.
And that type of execution took place outside of the camp, which was away from the homes of the people. But all the people had to be present and participate in some way. Now, another method of capital punishment was burning the convicted person to death, which is also awful. And as I said, this was mostly reserved for sex offenders, and like very commonly used for the daughter of a priest who sexually misbehaves so that it humiliates her father, right? She gets death by fire. Also, thank you, my dear. If a man marries his mother-in-law while he's still married to her daughter, then all three of them have to suffer with death by fire. Horrible, right?
I don't know why the wife would have to.
So this was not an uncommon way to punish people in the ancient Near East and throughout the Babylonian Empire. And it was also used in Egypt. We thought Egypt was so cool, you know, not cutting people's head off. But Egyptian rulers used it to punish looters, people who took advantage of a situation and looted homes, and also rebels. If you rebelled against the Pharaoh, you were burned alive. But as usual, the Assyrians win the prize for the worst way to die by fire. And just so you know, a woman could be sentenced to death by fire if she appeared in public without a veil. The Assyrians were really bad guys. They would burn anybody, actually. So here's how the good guys burned the bad guys. First thing they did, or I should say, the bad guys burned the bad guys, the Assyrians. First, they covered the convicted person in dung, excrement. And whose excrement? It's not specified. But why did they do this? You kind of touched on that. Humiliation. Just humiliated them. And this was definitely not a typical tie the convicted person to a post, on top of some fuel and then ignite the burn killing. No, another way to do this that was very common was to force the accused person's, force his mouth open, and then pour molten lead down his or her throat. But at least that would have been a quick death. And don't think this was just crazy Near Eastern people who did this. It was very, very common around the world, but not the molten lead going down your throat, but burnings. The Romans were excellent at this, and so were the Irish. The Celts burned their criminals alive, and the Greeks burned their kids, and I mean children, not baby goats. They offered their children as burning sacrifices to their gods. And burning criminals alive is not just an ancient custom, because it survived the test of time. The British, the civilized Western British, in the late 1770s, Britain had 222 crimes that were punishable by death by burning. Yeah, can you believe it?
No.
And we think another brutally bloody method of punishment, which didn't always result in death, was flogging. And this was standard punishment for breaking all those I shall not or you shall not commands, the ones that you shouldn't do. But it's interesting, 39 lashes was the limit for flogging. Now, does anyone know why 39 was the limit?
I've heard it, but I don't remember what it
Well,
was.
it's 40. We know 40 is a big number. 40 less 1. And remember, Paul got this very punishment, and so did Jesus, right? Jesus was, yeah. It didn't kill him, though. 39 lashes. And the reason it's 39 is because the scientists, the Faucis of that day, said 40 will kill you. 40 is a death sentence. So 39 lashes is the punishment. But this punishment of 39 lashes almost always resulted in death. Death either by infection, all those open wounds, or by internal organ danger and internal bleeding and superficial bleeding. You could bleed to death. And if the accused didn't die, he or she would probably be crippled for life, unable to work, so ostracized by the community, and that person would die of starvation, ashamed and alone. It's so awful, right? How could we do this? Well, the death penalty is still practiced in our country.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us believe, and I'm not including myself, many Americans believe that it serves as a deterrent. Many believe that it doesn't. So it's a very tricky question if it does deter crime or if it doesn't. And there really is no definitive answer statistically. But but there's lots of theories and opinions. And the most obvious theory is the theory of choice. A person who's about to commit a crime, a heinous crime, balances the benefits and the costs of a crime. Do you think that's true?
No.
That's open to very spirited debate. Even the research is open to debate. So if I were to say to you, well, here's the numbers, right? Here's the statistics. That doesn't mean that we get the answers statistically, because now the tough part is analyzing the data. What do these numbers mean? And that brings me back to something that I learned about research when I was working on another degree, long time ago. Here's the story. When you want to hire an accountant, a money person to work for you or your company, you should ask him or her, how much is 2 plus 2? Well, if the guy who wants to be your accountant says, oh, 4, forget about him. Don't hire that guy, because you definitely don't want that person handling your books, because the right answer to how much is 2 plus 2 has to be, oh, sir, how much do you want it to be? That's what your accountant should.
Oh, no.
That's a good accountant, not someone. And we all fudge those little numbers. It's called skewing data, right? Making numbers say what we want them to say. I told you 1,000,000 times. No, you didn't. This is the first time I'm ever hearing it. We do it all the time. But still, we should try to present two sides. Here's one side. Punishment does not work. It does not keep society safe. And we've been hearing a lot of that in these last few years. And one statistic claims that 60% of the people in prison have been in prison previously to the crime they committed. And we call that recidivism. However, say the other side, 100% of those executed for crimes die. So there's no recidivism. And it's not an easy topic, and it's hard to stay in the middle when it is a matter, and back then when it was a matter of life and death. So see if you agree with the notion that these laws that we're reading now, that were given to Moses by God at Sinai, they are really trying to find that middle way, not the right, not the left, but the middle. Now, the reality is that ancient Israelites lived in a very, very violent world. Still, the rabbis say, deciding guilt or innocence is more important than the punishment. But once the defendant is found guilty, the big question becomes how big the punishment should be. And the answer to that seems to be big, very big, and very public. Everyone should see what happens if you do something wrong. So trials were very important. And there's lots of laws that deal with just the evidence and the witnesses. These are very important. For example, the crime had to have been observed by a minimum of 2 witnesses. And the 2 witnesses had to be adults. And they couldn't be ex-cons. They had to be upstanding citizens. And they couldn't be related to the defendant or the victim. And written testimony was never accepted. Had to be oral, which sounds almost modern, right? Sounds fair. But I like this next stipulation. A confession was never accepted as proof of guilt in the ancient world by ancient Israelites. Self-incrimination was not allowed. And the reason that the rabbis would not allow it is because by self-incriminating, I did it, kill me, it assumes that the man belongs only to himself. He has a right to do whatever he wants with himself. But rabbis say not so. Every human belongs to God. And so no person has the right to harm another or to harm himself or herself. You don't have that right. That's up to God. So this ruling by the rabbis also serves as a form of protection against the authorities torturing or pressuring a defendant to get a confession. And that makes sense. We just saw that in our lifetime with the Miranda rulings, right? Protection against self-incrimination. You have the right to remain silent, but most criminals don't have the ability, right? They don't stay silent. But here's another interesting ancient Israelite stipulation that has not survived into our modern law codes. A lot of what happened back then came right into our judicial system, but this one concerning eyewitnessing did not. So, eyewitnessing, what does that mean? Well, back then it was very clear what it meant. The crime had to be seen by 4 eyes. So listen to this. You and your friend see a man with a knife in his hand chasing another man who appears to be running for his life, and they both run into a cave. Only one guy comes out of the cave, the one with the knife, and now the knife is dripping blood, and that man is covered with blood. And when you look into the cave, you can see the other guy is dead in the cave from multiple stab wounds. Now you saw this, but your testimony would not hold up in a court of ancient Israelite court of law, because the question would be, did you see my client stab the dead man? And that's kind of the same question today, right? Also, ancient Jewish courts demanded that malice forethought had to be established. There had to be clear evidence of premeditation. So let's say that you can prove the guy bought the knife. We have proof, receipts, no doubt about it. The murder weapon belongs to the defendant. But can you prove that he bought it to murder the victim? And these technicalities serve as yet another answer to the forever question that we posit. Why should we study this Old Testament when it's nothing but useless law? That Jesus came and changed all the unjust laws. And we all know Jesus really hated Jewish lawyers, right? He hated those Pharisees. Well, not so fast, says Jesus, because these laws really do show the profound dignity and respect to which every child of God is entitled, even accused murderers. And in the Torah, premeditation is carefully defined. Murder, premeditated murder, is a very serious offense, so it's seriously and carefully examined. For instance, it must be proven beyond any doubt, not a reasonable doubt. That's our system. In Torah, God's system, it's any doubt. There can be no doubt that the accused murderer knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong, and he did it anyway. And how was that done? Well, there had to be 2 witnesses to testify that the accused had been warned that stabbing was a capital crime. Then the accused had to be heard saying, I want to stab him to death. And then the 2 witnesses had to testify, we heard someone warn the accused, and we saw the accused being warned. That's a capital offense. We just went through this with Rabbi Shalom at Chabad. And then you have to hear the accused say, I know it's wrong, and I take it upon myself to do it anyway. And that's how you prove malicious intent, which is why we changed it, obviously. It's very difficult. But this is interesting. Litigants in Jewish religious courts, and this is true even to this day, you don't employ counsel, you don't hire an attorney. There are no lawyers in the courtroom. And why is that? Well, back in the day, lawyers were not held in high regard. It was believed that lawyers distorted the truth and they twisted the testimony and they offered dishonest advice. And seriously, I'm not making this up. I mean, we've kind of heard that, right? And not just about ancient Jewish lawyers. This is real. And so are these punishments. They all result in death. But the discomfort on the way to death varies on the severity of the crime. And the absolute worst crime that anyone could ever commit in ancient Israel is, guess what? Now remember, this is Torah. So what do you think the worst crime in Torah is?
Blasphemy.
Close.
Blasphemy.
Idolatry. Yeah,
Yeah.
and exactly. And worshiping other gods, giving your honor and respect to other gods. And idolatry was closely followed by incest, and then rape, punishable by death. And in many cases, the witnesses to these crimes, they also served as the executioners. But what if there were mitigating circumstances? What then? Well, look at verse 13, because that's addressed there. If he did not do it by design, but it came about by an act of God, God says, I will assign you a place where you can flee. Now, Robert Alter, who I use a lot when I do these studies, he translates this verse like this. And he who did not plot it, but God made it befall him, I shall set apart a place to which he may flee. Sanctuary, a sanctuary. So we're talking about asylum, a place of refuge, like a sanctuary space for unintentional homicide. And we call that in our judicial system manslaughter. Manslaughter. I don't think that's a great name for it. You know, it sounds like you just went out and slaughtered a man. But it's a lesser charge than murder. So, do you hear this law saying the manslaughterer was an unwitting agent? It was really God that caused the death to occur. Well, he just moved his head that way, so it didn't just get his ear, it went right through his brain. You know, was that God? Was that the guy who shot the gun? And you can hear people say, wasn't me, it was God, right? So do you think God would actually cause something like this?
No.
Now, remember the guy with the knife running into the cave and coming out with the bloody knife? Just picture him coming out saying, it wasn't me, that dead guy in there, I didn't do it, it was God. God made him run into my knife 16 times. Well, that doesn't sound right. No, so what's really going on here? Well, scholars say that the rabbis are trying to prevent future murders by preventing blood revenge killings. So they're trying to limit vendettas, revenge killers. You killed one of mine, so I'll kill one of yours, or maybe even two of yours. And this was a real problem with the ancients, and it was taken very seriously by members of society, and it was all about blood. And we've been reading about blood and how serious it is, shedding blood, since back in Genesis 9, when God himself tells Noah, whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man his blood shall be shed. It's very serious, God. So imagine, God is judge, jury, and executioner. And we're going to see later on in this parsha that this blood for blood demand extends to the unborn, the fetus in the womb, and euthanasia, killing somebody, mercy killing, not allowed. Not ever. You can't put somebody out of their misery. Mercy killers get no mercy. They get executed. And the same thing with suicide. Never, under any circumstances, is suicide allowed, because human life is considered sacred. And that's good. But if we listen closer, we can hear the local laws saying more than the Torah. And you hear local laws calling for blood. Now, remember, way back then, in the early days, the Israelites were nomads, right? They semi-nomadic at least. There were no towns, no villages, permanent. So of course there were no prisons, but there were families, and we call them mishpahas, like we call ourselves, clans or tribes, extended families. But some of them were actually related by blood. But there was a strong sense of kinship, that had to be a strong sense of kinship so that everyone would survive. And if there was any blood connection, and there was always some blood connection, they were considered blood brothers. So to affront one of the brothers was to affront all of the blood brothers. And murder was a particularly heinous crime because it permanently removed that brother from the family. And they needed the help of everyone, so it had to be avenged. And there was almost a fanatical and mysterious concept of blood. And back in the day, it's hard to get a clear definition of blood. No one really knew for sure, but they knew it was precious and serious and dangerous. Remember when Cain killed Abel, and God says, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." So even God thinks this is serious, and so do his children. So to this day, in many Jewish communities, blood is never eaten. No rare steaks, not ever. No medium rare hamburgers. And blood can be very damaging. The victim's blood will actually pollute the land, according to some. That's how dangerous it is. So out of this comes those blood vengeance, kind of mob killings. And sadly, this is universal, and it's still alive today. So this law that we just read in verse 13 is an attempt to limit and eventually eliminate the call for blood revenge. And God will provide a sanctuary for those who aren't completely guilty. But what about a man who is completely guilty? All right, and I'm going to just finish verse 14, and then I got to go. So let's look at verse 14. When a man schemes against another man and kills him treacherously, you shall take him from my altar to be put to death. And another way to say this is, should a man scheme against his fellow man to kill him by cunning, from my altar you shall take him to die. Another way to say it, if however a man, now this is somebody who's in a sanctuary spot, which we can sort of identify with that, right? If a man goes to a sanctuary city and law enforcement follows him, does Seattle or does Chicago have a right to shelter that man? Well, here's what God is saying with his sanctuary. If a man acts presumptuously toward his neighbor so as to kill him craftily, you are to take him even from my altar, that he may die. So God says the same thing 3 different ways. So there's no way that we can misunderstand it. There is no refuge for murders. And I thought it was interesting, the use of the word presumptuously. And we don't hear that word used a lot. I don't remember the last time I said it, presumptuously. It's kind of an old-fashioned word. But the true meaning is to boil up, to seethe proudly. So it actually means in this situation to assume that you have the right to kill or to murder. And God wants you to know that there's no place for a person like that, not even at his holy altar. And there were a lot of other altars throughout the ancient Near East, and altars to pagan gods and goddesses, and even those were considered to be places of safety, places of asylum. But that's all gone now, and it seems reasonable. But look at the next law. See if you think this is reasonable. If a man strikes his father or his mother, he shall be put to death. Now notice, the law doesn't say if he kills a parent by striking. Only the striking is mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So you just have to hit mom or dad to get executed. Now, do you think that's fair?
Mm.
Well, to be fair, the rabbis add later on that the strike, that hit that the kid gives his parents, must cause severe physical harm, real physical injury. And clearly this is parental abuse, which we know breaks the fourth or the fifth commandment. But later on, the Septuagint implies, Septuagint is the Greek translation of what we're reading now, that this law that we're reading in 14 has to be a repeated offense. This is a matter of a man regularly beating his mother or father.
Abusive.
Yes, abusively, and this will not be tolerated by God. So I am so sorry to stop here, but I would like you to, I'll just tell you what I got up to, and we'll go back and do this. Talking about just finishing up this particular, where am I getting to the end here? Verses 18 and 19 with angry violence, and verses 20 and 21, take a look at those. Slaves or free, how are their punishments provided? And how does God get involved with this? And I think, yeah, next week we're going to start with Exodus 21, verses 22 to 36. But if you could just finish the rest of this, and I'm going to go bring your love to Jan, who's being memorialized today. She loved Bible study. So it's important that I be there. And thank you, Elaine, for finishing it up. Talk among yourselves
Okay,
and tell me everything. Yeah.
I guess, I don't know whether we need to move the camera or, no,
Is it turned off?
no, it's still on. I'm gonna turn it off, though. You want me, I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the,
Bye, everyone. We love you, and text me, let me know. And thank you, Marcia, for that beautiful baby girl.